collaborate and talk about how we can move forward. And these connections or these collaborations or discussions need to be very genuine and vulnerable. We need not to hide what is happening in our newsrooms, because if you hide it, there's some other newsroom that is going through the same stuff. And I think by hiding the challenges you're facing, you're doing a disservice to the entire industry. I think let's be vulnerable during these sessions and open up some of the challenges that you're facing or opportunities that we see, and be open to collaborate across media houses. I'm also very happy to have all the partners who joined us. I'll not go to list all of you. If you have a name tag, you'll see all of them there. But I'm super excited to the potential of these 2 days. Let's make this time count. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think the mood has been set, and I'm so happy. For those of you who are not Kenyan, I'm glad you came at a point where our country, today we are praying for the country. We are praying for the rains as a country, the whole of, I don't want to talk a lot, but we are a prayerful nation. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
So, but I'm glad. So I want us to be seen. So kindly, if you can be able to take a photo, a selfie, and just say where you are at and what we are doing. Remember, use the hashtag Reimagine Media, and also hashtag Africa Media Festival. Thank you. Asante, Android.
You're
Let
so
me hide my Android. Mine.
This violence will stop. It will stop forthwith. Android, oh yay! Some of you are embarrassed. You were more before. So the Wi-Fi is open. We have confirmed that. You can log in as Radisson guest. For those of you who just got in, please access the internet as quickly as possible. A couple of things. We will be running a bit of a poll throughout the day, and so we probably want to start with one question that you can all sample. And then we'll be telling you just how the flow of the day will be as we then invite our keynote speakers to address us and launch officially. You know, in Kenya we launch things. We either cut ribbons, release doves, or just officially open things. So one of those things will happen today. So we can pick a poll question for them.
All right. Is Kenya the best? No, I'm kidding. I can see the UG guys already are like, what is happening? And TZ, there are those neighbors who are just, they don't have issues. They're just quiet. But things are happening in their place, you know. They're just quiet. They buy a new car. They're just quiet. In South Africa, they buy something new, just a new phone. You will know they have bought something. Yeah, and I love that. So, the poll.
So there are themes basically that we'll be trying to get your feedback on. One of them is the state of Africa's newsroom, like what's going on right now. And again, some of these things have already been talked about, but just some questions for you to think about. If you could have any superpower to fix African newsrooms, what would it be? You have some options. The first one is teleportation to avoid deadline stress. B, mind reading to uncover hidden biases. This one I already have, so I know exactly what you're thinking. Invisibility to witness unethical practices. That would be C. And D, the ability to generate unlimited caffeine. I think my people on the right are guys of D, yes? How many of you want to be teleported? People, teleportation to avoid deadline stress. How many of you, by a show of hands? Nice. Okay, 5. So we're dealing with stress quite well. Mind reading to uncover hidden biases. How many of us? Interesting. More of you. Invisibility, so that you can witness unethical practices. I mean, what is an unethical practice, really? What is it? The ability to generate unlimited caffeine. How many of you want that one? Okay, we'll be sampling more of your answers as we go. But I think it's time now for us to tell you what the flow of the event is today. You all received your programs. If you don't have the booklet, you probably have a tag that's hanging from your neck. The program is actually on your neck. It's on that set of tags that you have. And so we'll be breaking out after the keynote addresses into different rooms, different sessions. So if you can just turn to your program with me so I can show you how to read it and how to make sense of it, please. Are we all there? Okay. So you can see we're doing extremely well for time. And so what we're going to do is, after the keynote addresses, if you just go to 10 a.m. with me, there'll be 3 things happening. Kilimanjaro 2 and 3 is where we are right now. And so there will be the State of Africa's newsroom, what's going on right now, what's going right, what's going wrong in Africa journalism. That will be an hour-long session that will be held here. There will be an exhibition in Kilimanjaro 1. Why can't I say that word? Kilimanjaro 1. Is on my far right, and there'll also be the PRX BML podcasting hackathon. For those of you who are interested in that, that will be on the first floor in a room called Elgon 1. These 3 things will be happening at the same time. So it's based on your level of interest, and of course in some of these spaces it'll be based on capacity. So if the room gets full, come back here. There are more seats, okay? We'll be hanging out here. So that's what's our first session, and as you've been told, long coffee breaks, long lunch breaks, so that you can network.
Amazing. So for all the Elgons, we're gonna go left, just outside where we took tea, and then you go straight, and then you'll see some stairs over there. You'll see something happening. So that's where you're gonna be having the Elgons. For Kilimanjaro 2 and 3 is here. 1 is next door.
And again, if you have any questions, we're available, so are the hosts. So ladies and gentlemen, allow us now to introduce our first keynote speaker. His name is Abdul Noor Mohammed, and he is the VP, the Vice President for Africa Luminate. Luminate's funding activities in Africa are under his docket. He brings more than 20 years experience in consulting and leading successful civic engagement programs across Africa through grant making, comprehensive support, and advocacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a warm round of applause to Abdul Noor Mohammed.
There. I was saying all of us must have read or heard this really famous poem by Martin Niemöller. First they came. No, first they came for the socialists, but I did not speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Now try to imagine if that poem had been written differently. First, they came for the journalists. You think I was going to go on? But that's the point. If they come for the journalists, we would never know what happened next. We'd all be in the dark. Maurice and Christine from Baraza Media Lab, friends from across the continent and the world, good morning. Karibuni sana. Thank you for heeding this invitation to reimagine media in Africa. I am Abdul Nur Mohammed, the Vice President Africa for Luminate. As you've heard, Luminate is a global philanthropy with 200 partners across the world working to ensure that everybody, especially the most vulnerable among us, has the information and power to influence decisions that affect us all. We fund existing organizations and collaborate on new initiatives. In Africa, we work in Kenya and Nigeria, and we do some regional work in South Africa. In my work, I'm keen on working with creative ideas to ensure that everyone can participate in decisions that affect their lives through access to accurate and relevant information. When we started this journey with our gracious host, Baraza Media Lab, in 2019, our vision was to nurture and support the media ecosystem in Kenya. It is therefore a privilege and a mark of hope to see this diverse gathering today coming from across Africa. It is an incredible fit to bring such a diversity of great minds together here today. All of us believe in the value of the media in our society. So how far can we go if we do this together? Media is a key pillar in a democratic society because it ensures that we can speak directly to our leaders and with each other. African media in the last 2 decades has experienced a great revolution. A few decades ago, even television was inaccessible to most of our people, and there are only a few voices that we could listen to who dominated our airwaves. Our phones were restricted to just voice calls. And now we can all contribute and share our opinions with the world. We can text, send and receive money, tell the time, watch a movie on a telephone. And everyone is a movie star on TikTok. From shortwave radio, it was barely accessible, to satellite television, from FM stations to blogs and social media, from a single African film in a year to millions of videos from Africans around the world, from social media filters to artificial intelligence. At one point, we believed that social media was only for young people, but now we enjoy video content even from our parents and our grandparents who are sharing the world from their perspective on a medium that even they never imagined would exist. As we reflect in awe how far we've come, let us also acknowledge the moment in time that we find ourselves in. Global catastrophes, economic upheaval, a growing youthful population on the continent, technological dynamism, and weakening democracies. But all of this present an opportunity for us to pause and take time to innovate and invest in the African media. We have a chance to rejuvenate our information ecosystem as we know it and anticipate how to weather the coming crisis. In Kenya, the government has been in consultation with various media outlets to address the economic fallout that has led to job cuts in the industry. And this is a notable step in the right direction. We have funded an innovative media initiatives to bring forward the voices of people who have often been left out in national discussions. And we want to acknowledge the work that is being done by various other funders who are here today to support new media. The content creators who continue to push us to realize the heights that we can achieve as Africans to explore our immense diversity and creativity. We are deeply grateful for your efforts, and we look forward to hearing and learning from you at the festival. Everyone who works tirelessly to ensure that we have the right legal and technological frameworks to thrive safely as we reimagine the ecosystem, your efforts are critical to our discussions during these 2 days, and we look forward to engaging with you. At the end of the week, I hope in our various capacities we leave this festival answering these 3 vital questions. How best that we build the media businesses to withstand crisis? How can we collaborate to support new and emerging media? And third, which voices have we left out and are we still leaving out, and how do we bring these voices forward? As Luminate, we are committed to learning from you and finding new ways to work together to reimagine the media ecosystem in Africa. Asanteni.
Thank you so much, Abdul, for inspiring us, for triggering us with questions. I think that's a good way to start any session. Okay.
Wow, amazing. I'm already in the mood, and, it's amazing. So we are getting into it, and we're going to go into our first session. But before that, I have a question for all of us. It's a yes or no answer. Do you believe the African journalism is adequately addressing important socio and political issues in the region? I think I'll repeat again. Are you conflicted? Do you believe that African journalism is adequately addressing important socio and political issues in the region?
By a show of hands, of course.
Yes?
Yes and no. That's an interesting one. Is that a yes? The hand is for yes. It's adequately addressing. It is not. Or you are yes and no.
So that's a no?
Yes or no? What about this section here? Yes or no? You're like, you agree with that suggestion? So we need a yes, no, or yes and no. Or somewhat. What about here? Somebody said sometimes. This gentleman at the back here. Your neighbor. Lady in the red top with. What was your answer? You said yes and no as well? Okay.
Amazing. It's so interesting. And that's why we are here. That's what the the first session is going to be about. But about now, I'm being told for the guys who are going for the hackathon, it's happening now in Elgon 1. So you'll just go out on the left and then right to the stairs. You'll be able to see where the terraces are.
Okay, so we'll start with the State of Africa's Newsroom. That's our first panel that's going to be taking place here. And as we have the transition of those who will be leaving us to go to the other two spaces, allow me to introduce those who will be on the panel. I'll start with their moderator, Samira Solani. I'm sorry about that. Please come up, Samira. Could we welcome them with a round of applause, please, as they come? Charles Onyango Obo, please do come up. Atandiwe Saba, please join us on stage. Joe Ageo. Joe, please do come up on stage. And Maria Sarungi Tsehai. Say hi, karibu sana.
All right. And we can come now in front. Hello, we are still in session. We are still in session. If you have a seat in front of you, please come forward. Come forward. If you have a seat next to you, in front of you. In South Africa, they say in front of you. So come in front so that we are together. So if you have a seat in front of you, kindly fill it up.
All right, and any one of you who still would like to join the hackathon, the PRX hackathon that's happening on the first floor at Elgon 1, please do make your way upstairs now as that session is beginning. You can also take time to look at the exhibition in Kilimanjaro 1. Okay, kind request to those of you who are further back, please do come to the fore. It does look a little bit strange, and I always say, if you're closer to the front, it's always better. Closer to power. Please do come forward. We'll give you a minute to do that as they get mic'd. Once again, our hashtags for this two-day event is hashtag Africa Media Festival and hashtag Reimagine Media, which is also the theme for this year's inaugural premier Africa Media Festival. All right. So everybody's comfortable? Everybody's ready?
I'm
Great.
still seeing some blue seats. So if you don't have someone behind you and in front of you, there's a seat, kindly fill it up.
Or do we go and walk with them?
So that we are a unit.
Yeah, the beauty of cordless microphones. Let me show you a trick.
Amazing.
Oh my gosh, look at the magic. Wow. Wow, yes, please come to the front. Hi. How are you? You okay where you are? You don't feel like moving forward? No? You like in like way. He says he likes being with him. I can't argue with that. Hi, how are you? And you? We just want to fill up some of the seats. I see some of them are already being filled up. Yeah? Come, at least come sit here.
Amazing. And if you just came in,
Thank
you
you.
can use this to check your programs so that we stick to time,
Ardi.
so that we know where we need to be at a particular time. If you don't have one, you can check your neighbors and maybe you can pick it up from them. When they are not looking, of course. No, I'm kidding. So if you're coming in, we're just getting started on our first session. The state of Africa's newsroom is the topic. Maybe after this we'll go around and we check in different countries how we are doing, how we are feeling about the state of affairs in our African newsrooms. So I think
we're good to go.
okay.
Our moderator, Samira Karibusana, over to you.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me? Oh my God, I can hear myself, damn. Okay, hi everyone, and happy Valentine's Day, Galentine's Day, Character Development Day, depending on how things are going for you. Thank you so much. Everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see a full house, even though I'm really nervous. Just a heads up, if you see me on my phone, it's not because I'm texting that guy that won't text me back, it's because I'm checking my notes and keeping track of time. So I'm going to quickly start by introducing our panel. So on my right is Joe Agayo. He's a journalist, media manager, and debate moderator with wide experience spanning more than 24 years. He's covered major local and international news events and presided over the coverage of 4 general elections and 2 national referenda in Kenya. He's played critical roles in Kenya's presidential debates, including co-moderating 3 of them, and he's the group editorial director at the Nation Media Group. Next to him is Athendiwe Sabash. She's the Mail and Guardian deputy editor, multi-award-winning journalist with a background in investigative and data journalism. She established the Mail and Guardian data desk and has been internationally recognized for her work in investigative data journalism. On my left is Maria Surungi-Tisai. She's a media and communication expert. She's the director, producer of award-winning films, documentaries, and has been a presenter and producer of many well-known and highly viewed TV shows in Tanzania. Currently, Maria has relocated and is working in Nairobi, Kenya with, well, we all know where Nairobi is, but anyway, with Wanzo TV. Maria is the founder of the hashtag movement Change Tanzania, and is better known since 2021 for her Twitter Spaces that she organizes with activists called Maria Spaces. And next to her is our social media king, Charles Onyango-Obo, a Ugandan journalist, author, futurist, former editor of Mail and Guardian Africa, former managing director of The Monitor, former executive editor for the Africa and Digital Media Division with Nation Media Group, and he's currently curator of The Wall of Great Africans, which is a digital memorial to noteworthy Africans. I hope I got everyone's names right. This is a problem with the colonizer accent. You know, when June was like, who's from the UK, I was hiding my face because nothing good can come of that. But if I did get anything wrong, I apologize and please do correct me. So I've been told that when you're a panelist, an hour flies by. When you're a moderator, an hour feels like years. So I'm going to try and keep to time. I'm going to, try and keep everything very interactive because ultimately, as much as everyone here can talk about the state of Africa's newsrooms, many of you are the consumers, so you can actually tell us, you're just as much experts as these guys are in terms of what the challenges are at the moment, what's going well, what's not going well. So please interrupt with questions, comments, as you please, and if you're feeling shy, I'm sure one of the team will be happy to take your questions on paper and bring them over. So I'm going to start with asking all panelists to, in just a few sentences, sum up what they think the state of Africa's newsrooms are currently. Start with you, Charles.
Okay, that's a tricky one. There are a couple of trends, actually. I see 12 trends, but I'll just talk about 2 or 3. And I'll look at the trends, the state of the newsroom as an expression of what is coming out of it and how they are responding to the forces outside. The first trend that interests me is what I call the rise of the raging machines. Because what has happened is, if you look at the newsrooms today, because of a combination of several forces, one, social media. Secondly, there have been some very positive developments. There are all kinds of new funding models which have given media a bit of creative freedom. But what has happened is that this is happening at a time when you have a very, very deep influence, basically, of film culture, film and social media culture in the newsroom. So we have seen, traditionally the media was about something is right or wrong, but now we've gone to this stage of bad guys and good guys, and the media now, like the movies, we have villains. So every story, a lot of stories have villains at their center. And one of the things that has also happened is that we now have what you call ranting, journalism as ranting. So there's a lot of ranting in journalism. So the result of that is that you have a lot of rage. And it's a lot of heat, but not a lot of enlightenment. So that is the first thing that, that I've seen. The second is, it's related to that in the sense of what I call the new architecture of censorship. Because traditionally censorship was, you get pressure from the government or the corporates to bend coverage. But we now see a new trend where censorship has been subcontracted by the state. And it is very subtle. I mean, it's very nefarious because it's subtle and effective. How has this subcontracting happened? A lot of people like, and I don't want to say people like Joe, you recognize it because the advertisers are very important because of the economic situation we are in and the evolution of markets. But for advertisers, their biggest client is government. So if you are a bank, you want to get the contract to bank the 700 million COVID fund. And you go to the government and the government tells you, we'd want to give it to you, but you are supporting our enemies. You are supporting people who are critical to us. And say that critical media is a nation media group. What do you think the MD of the bank will do? He will tell you, I can't support you because I am being told that, you are harming our business. Now, it's a very, very different conversation from what it used to be. And the evidence shows that this is subcontracting censorship to these kind of players has had a very, very deleterious effect. And we are not able, to see it. And it presents a whole generation, a new type of challenge. So I'll speak to those two, I'll stick to those two for now.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. I think I would look at it from two perspectives. But before I actually get into those two perspectives, I want to point out that what we're seeing and what we talk about as a revolution, a digital revolution or evolution for me, did not start today. It started more than 10 years ago, but a lot of people were not aware of it. So what happened is there was a whole thinking, especially in Africa, but even there was a thinking from Europe toward Africa where they said, when you talk about digital, they were like, people cannot afford it. People will not be there. Forget about digital. Don't talk about digital. And that was the biggest mistake, that we were not prepared for it. I think Africa's biggest problem has been that we accepted the stereotype that the West placed us in about 15 years ago that you guys cannot afford the internet. And we believed it. And those of us in the media acted as if we're going to continue being the way we are. And the explosion happened when the mobile internet became affordable. That's when everything changed. And suddenly the newsroom is not the people who are sitting inside, in huge newsrooms and determining, and the editor was not determining what's going to happen. Nobody was determining. The so-called speaking heads suddenly became irrelevant. My biggest challenge is whether the newsrooms are going to be able to adapt or die. There's no other way. So I think when we talk about the state of newsrooms, primarily is we have to accept that this is going to happen. And I remember, because you did mention the Change Tanzania movement, as a communication expert, that's the first thing I talked about in 2012. And I remember when I brought it up, there was a lady who stood up and said, you know what, you're such an elitist. And I said, why am I an elitist? Oh, because people cannot afford it. And I said, you will soon see, instead of buying television and a car, a working family's first and a young man's first objective will be to get a mobile phone. This is 2012. And today, I can bet you that there is no young person who is happy not to have a mobile phone that's connected to the internet. So I think the first conversation or the perspective is from the consumers. Is the newsroom talking to the consumers the way they want? Are people still waiting for the 8 o'clock news? And if the people are not waiting for the 8 o'clock news, what are the newsrooms doing for that? So I think that's one very important perspective. But the second perspective, I think, is within us. Like, how do we, as the media fraternity, adapt to these changes? And what I'm still seeing is there is an analog thinking in a digital world. And we keep trying to justify that by saying that we need to be able to make sure that the news is accurate, and all that is true, giving more in-depth looks. But how do you do that at this time and age? How do you do that rightfully, as Charles has pointed out, at a time when people are not going to spend with you? Because you know what the sponsors will say, all the big spenders, they'll tell you, I'm going to go and buy my ads on Google, right? So they will go and buy the ads on Google, and they're not going to bother to have it in print or to have it on your TV at 8 o'clock. So the question is now going to be, what kind of modeling are we going to come up with, both from financing, but also from reporting? What do we give that's different from the blogger? What do we give from the one-man newsroom that is able to go in with that little camera, right, phone camera, record what is happening here, edit it and stream it live on YouTube? How are you going to compete with that? You, as a newsroom, you're going to hire a brigade of people to come here, set up 5-6 cameras, and stream it to you, and you're going to have a separate social media team and all that. So I think unless, as I say, we adapt, we die.
Someone saying you can't hear me.
No, we can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
That's better, I hope. I think this is a complex question. First of all, even the very idea that there is such a thing as the African newsroom. What are we talking about? Do we have one thing that is the African newsroom? Because I think where we are, if you ask me, is an inflection point in many regards. If you think about what's going on in a newsroom in Kenya or in Ghana or in South Africa, whichever part of the continent you think about, I don't think it is necessarily true that they have unique problems from what's happening around the world. I think the expressions might be different. We might have to redefine what is African journalism, what is African newsroom, but that is a much wider conversation. If I talk about the inflection point, it is to say that we either go forward or we fall back. That is where we are now, and we've seen a lot of newsrooms basically closing shop. We've seen a lot of journalists losing their jobs and that sort of thing, and it's part of the wider problem that is going on. But the second thing I think is that there is a bit of an identity crisis in many of our newsrooms, trying to find what our right voice should be in the midst of what's going on right now. Because there has been such a massive change in the ecosystem where we work that I think it is increasingly difficult for many people in that space to actually understand what journalism is anymore. There are very many people who have different perspectives of what journalism entails or ought to entail. There are certain people who say, well, there is something particularly African about what we do. You know, this morning I was thinking about what I should wear to this event, and I looked at a few things in my wardrobe and they were looking colorful enough, so there was a bit of a tick there that, yeah, maybe in Africa we are supposed to be a bit colorful. Then I saw there was one had a button which I wasn't very sure whether it was African, and there's another one that had a zip, which the last time I checked was a Swedish invention. So I had a bit of this conversation going on in my head, which is a conversation I bring here. We all have been made to report, tell our stories in various languages that are not necessarily African. Is that something that we think about? Is it having an impact on how we tell our stories? I have a friend of mine who tells me that there is a whole problem with how journalism is conceived in the first place. In the African context, we tell stories in winding narratives before we get to the point, but we have all been trained, break the news first and then tell us other things. So I think that before we say that this is how we do journalism in Africa, there is a cultural context. But let me come home. What's really happening in the newsrooms where we work is that that environment has changed, as I mentioned, so that, for example, people who are one time seen as interlopers, outsiders to the newsroom, are now quite central to what happens in the newsroom, because right now we are told about audiences. These are what the audience numbers look like. So as a journalist, before as an editor, I would have this gut feeling and say, this is the big story of the day, and I will go with it. Today, I will be talking to very many different people who work with audiences, and they will say, well, this is what the data says. That kind of story is no longer popular. So does it mean that the story that the audiences, however defined, are following is the story that is most important, however then you define what is important? So I think that the sort of shift in power balance, if you like, in the newsrooms is a critical issue that goes to the heart of the kind of stories, for example, that we tell. So I think as we examine the change in the business environment of journalism, as we think about the kind of skill sets that now come to bear on what then becomes the output of journalism, it is important for us to then tie the conversations and then say, in the context of a newsroom where everything has changed, what is the future of what one would call public interest journalism that might not necessarily be that popular, might not be trending on Twitter, but perhaps it is what we ought to be talking about. I will leave it for the moment, because I think this conversation will funnel out in different ways.
Wow. Let me just check my mic. Hello? Hi? No? No? Check mic, please.
Is it on?
Do you want to borrow mine? Let's bring it.
Now it's picking up. When I got invited to the African Media Festival, I automatically thought, wow, it's ambitious and going to be And when I was meeting the different speakers yesterday, I realized that exactly what my panelists are saying, that there's different problems in different newsrooms across the continent in different countries. But I think the one thing that is a thread throughout the newsrooms is the very changing times that we're in. And as a journalist, how do you adapt to that? How do you decide which story to tell? How do you decide how to prioritize the story? Are you writing the story? Are you using your phone to record the story? Are you competing with bloggers? Are you competing with TV stations? How is it working in the newsrooms? And journalists are finding it very difficult. Exactly what our panelists are discussing in terms of audiences. Now we're telling them about audience engagement and all the number of people that are reading your story or sharing your story or not sharing your story. And that is very scary for journalists who have always kind of put information out there. And now they're told that they also need to be listening. And that is the beginning of the changes that are in our newsroom. Yes, we are 10 or so years behind in terms of trying to figure out how do we engage with people to read our content, to engage with our content, to give information. But I think what is most important is that newsrooms are beginning to see this. We are in a constant state of influx of more information. Now we're already talking about AI. For newsrooms that are still trying to figure out how to bridge the digital divide in terms of, well, you're not just going to write it, you're also going to put out video, and who's going to actually get that video? Do they have the access to the digital, to a cell phone and internet access? And now we're already talking about AI. So newsrooms are quite afraid right now. Newsrooms are changing a lot right now. But what I was so interested in coming and having this discussion about the state of newsrooms is that newsrooms are beginning to become aware of that we have to change. We have to go back and talk to people and understand where people are. Because it's not just about writing stories anymore. It's about how we publish them. Where are people? Are people reading our stories on WhatsApp? Are people reading our stories on social media? How do you write for somebody who's going to pick up a Million Guardian story on Twitter or on Instagram? How do you communicate? And that's what we're supposed to be good at. As communicators, as journalists, as writers, we're supposed to be good at communicating. But for the longest time, we thought whatever we're putting out there, people will just read and our models will continue to work. They're not working, they are broken. But what I'm loving across the continent right now is that people are becoming aware of that and they're starting to innovate about how do we put our journalism out there. And I think just to start off that conversation, and in my mind, just thinking about the state of the newsroom, yes, it's a scary place. And probably it's a scary place across the world. It's not just in Africa, it's a scary place across the world. But journalists, I think if we keep with the journalism part and we continue to do the journalism and holding people accountable, and then start thinking, how do we get to the readers? It's no longer just about a newspaper or an online website. It's about various platforms, and we have to be getting there to put that information out there.
So it sounds like from the responses from the panelists that there's a few challenges, opportunities, depending on how you look at it. So it'd be social media, funding models, and censorship, and audience engagement, because you're dealing with a whole range of different demographics now, people who are younger, people who potentially didn't have access to the internet, and they do now. And I think I'm going to start with social media, because that seems to be the one that constantly comes up when we look at media as a whole. And I'm just going to ask about this thing about being first or being right. So last week in Kenya, there was an alleged, I'm going to emphasize on the word alleged because I'm told the man in question has 200 lawyers and I don't want to get sued, an alleged incident at the former CS for Interior's house. And we saw a lot of the media houses go on their breaking news on Twitter and be like, oh, the former CS's home has been surrounded, or he's spoken about it. And then the next day we saw various security agencies say, look, we didn't send out any officers, there was no raid. And while, I'm not going to debate whether it happened or not, because I'm on a tourist visa and all the rest of it, but I do think that it brings up, that question on, if you're getting a piece of information, do you go straight on social media using your media house's Twitter account and be like, breaking, this is what's happened? Or is it, this is what we're hearing, we better send some journalists out, verify, find out what's going on? And how do you manage the tensions between both things? Because if you say, no, we're not going to make this, we're not going to put this out in a tweet until we've figured out the story, are you losing an audience considering your competitors are potentially putting it out there without verifying, yet they're first? Whether they're right or not is a whole different matter. Charles? I want to ask all of you. Okay, Joe, you go first, Joe. Yeah, I didn't want to come across as targeting Joe and like indirecting his media house.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I need Charles to do something like that to me up here. No, I will not purport to speak for everyone, but I think that the whole debate about speed versus accuracy is an important one. I mean, it's good, it would be great to get both, but if you have to choose, obviously it's better to be last and right than to be first and wrong. That is really how I look at what we're dealing with now, because the truth is that breaking news is, quite frankly, no longer the forte of what you call mainstream media, however contested that term might be now, because, I mean, the news will be broken anyway, whether it is accurate or not. There'll be someone out there. And I think that the role that journalism, in my view, still holds, that being that last line of defense for the public, where they can come, and if they hear it from a journalist or from a media house, then they know that this thing is true. And I think that point that you're raising is extremely important. I think in the Kenyan context, the politics is such that sometimes even people claiming that something happened to them is a story, whether it is or not, because the possibility of things happening to people sometimes is very high. So even people claiming things happened to them when it didn't happen to them is a story, in the sense that, hey, this guy is saying this happened to them, maybe it didn't happen. And so uncertainty becomes a very difficult space to navigate, but in our context, sometimes the story is actually in the confusion that exists about particular kinds of stories. And I think that probably what you saw is a glimpse of that, sometimes stories can be so confusing that actually the only story you end up with is the confusion. So I think that's part of what happened. But to underline the fact that I think the bigger point is that for us as journalists, because this is really what ought to separate what is true journalism and what is not, because there are many people who have freedom to express themselves, but I think the degree of responsibility that comes with journalism is that you have verified the facts, that what you are relaying there is actually what is on the ground, including the fact that there's not much that we know about this situation. This is what it's presenting itself as it is, including what's not clear and what is yet to be verified. That is how I would look at it. But there, in my view, is no longer any contest between accuracy and speed.
Okay.
I think on my end, just get the mic back on. Okay, all right, back on. I think on my end, and most of the newsrooms I've worked in, and I think most of the newsrooms out there, I think getting it right is the most important part. The speed out there, and I think just as our responsibility as journalists, and we need to always keep that in mind. And I think a lot of my discussion is going to be around journalists and working in this new space. We always have to keep in mind that we are that particular line, that front line of actually informing people of what is correct and what isn't. The whole all our ethical issues right there. So being right is very important. If you can get it right at first, that's awesome. But I think when people come to whether you are an online site or newspaper or whatever you're putting out there, they need to feel that trust. And that's one of the issues that we're currently facing in a lot of our newsroom, that trust deficit between the people and the newsroom. So getting it right is very important. And I think also understanding who you're speaking to. You're not going to speak to everyone, and I think that kind of confusion in our media landscape is also hurting us and also ensuring that we have a lot more challenges. If we know, if as that particular media house or as that online news site, if you know who you are and you know the kind of target market that you are servicing, you know that you have what kind of, whether you're getting it first or getting it right or you're breaking site. And if you're trying to service everyone, that's where you're going to get lost in terms of who you are and what you're trying to do at the end of the day. So in the newsrooms that we currently are in, I think getting it right and being very clear about the identity of your particular media house and who you're talking to and why you're talking to them.
With the view around, you know, the level of trust you see when you speak to people in the newsrooms on the continent at the moment.
It's, you know, on this question, it kind of reminds me of what my mother-in-law says, and because it's the great hypocrisy of the industry. My mother-in-law says that if you want to know the kind of women men really want, listen to the kind of women they say they don't like.
We stand a man who quotes his mother-in-law.
So, yeah. So and you know that is the thing. You know that there is the normative part of this thing that it should be right, but the incentive in the newsroom is to be fast. And you know, people like us were wrecked over the calls because you know when. Because the logic is, even if you are wrong, the people will usually stay with the person who went with it first. So in public we all, we want to look all right and righteous and we'll say, but there is no incentive in the newsroom. You must be fast. That's where the reward is. There is a United Nations, we used to say, there is no use if it is perfect, if it gets to the market 2 hours late. So that is the thing now. I remember when I was working at the Reuters East Mediterranean Bureau in Cairo, we used to have up 7 versions of a story. So we would write them and line them up and say the oil minister, we know that the oil minister is going to make a statement on the price will either go up, down, or something. So we would do 7, sometimes 8 versions of a story, because then you just hope you pick the right one and you hit it and it goes fast. Because those milliseconds just turn to millions. And you know, that is the nature of the beast.
Maria?
So I think, first of all, listening, I think that we tend to think Africa is South Africa and Kenya. And I'm not saying it in a bad way. This is idealistic. I'm actually a little bit disappointed that there's no one from Tanzania from the newsroom, but they will tell you, they wouldn't be up here speaking the truth. The truth that, for example, in Tanzania, the TV that I owned and run was suspended twice by the government. And do you know why? First of all, they were looking for an excuse. Why were we getting calls? Why were we streaming live, news conferences from the opposition? We were one of the first online TV that covered the kidnapping of Mo Dewji and when he was found, the shooting of Tundu Lissu, interviews with Tundu Lissu just before he got shot. So you find that suddenly it becomes very dangerous to be first and not necessarily to be right. But then something else started happening. They started to bring laws, and this is something that I would really love us to also consider when we're talking about news and the state of newsrooms. In Tanzania, you find mainstream media is just as much restricted by the existing online content regulation, and I think part of the Nation Media, Mwananchi Online, was suspended online because of a very mundane story. What is happening now is that the censorship of state, especially of repressive states, and we have to be realistic, let's not try to sugarcoat this. Africa is full of governments that are seeking ways to control the narrative. And that's why I really loved what Abdul said. They first come for the journalists. And that's it. That's the truth. They will come for us first. We are the front line. In Tanzania, when they started arresting people, one of the first victims was the investigative reporter Eric Kabendera, because Eric Kabendera was talking reality. And his market was the Tanzanian audience, but he was selling it to international media. So when you ask me whether it's right to be first or accurate, I would first say, get your story out, even if you need to later explain that there were some parts of the story that's not accurate, get it out, because it's a matter of life and death. I'm very happy to see my dear colleague here, Hopewell. Hopewell is a survivor. He is, yeah. Please give him a round of applause. Just go online. I mean, we have a whole fraternity of media practitioners and journalists that know there is a matter of life and death whether you take your story out. Because what happened, and in this case even in Eric Kabendera, he was working on stories that would have implicated the Magufuli government. And they came for him. They came to his house, they raided him, they took him away. It took a lot of effort for us to identify where he is. He would have been disappeared. The other thing is, because of such horrific stories and such intimidation, I'm sorry to say, newsrooms, the mainstream media is no longer believed and trusted. So you will find, I would receive information, like I did last year, from the Maasai people, saying that they're being pursued by the government. They had video footage, they were shot, they were wounded by state security. Where could they take their story? Do you know where the story broke it on mainstream media first? Kenya. The Tanzanian media was not ready to talk about it, because if you do, there is so much repercussions. So I have a mixed feeling about it, because what I usually do is I trust much more social media videos or people who send me videos, and I'm ready to track down the authenticity of it and put it out even if the mainstream media is not ready to cover it. Because it, again, as I say, sometimes it's a matter of life and death. To finish up, there are people who don't have these stories, and you talked about public human interest. How many of the media houses are going to be ready, for example, to cover something that yesterday, by the way, you know, we did that just yesterday on Twitter Spaces that I host. You have a father who's been looking for his son since 2021, was abducted at night. And he's telling his story. He's been to the head of the security services, the inspector general, the past, the present one. He's been everywhere. He's even gone to the president. And nobody's helping him. And he's been telling his story via WhatsApp on a voice note. And you know what is strange? Not a single mainstream media said, let's go and find this man and ask him questions. His only security is to tell his story on social media. So I'm saying this to the newsrooms, adapt or die. If you find that the laws are so difficult that you can't operate in that environment, it is time to push back. And if you don't push back, then what will happen? You'll become a mouthpiece for a government that is repressive. You'll become a mouthpiece to business interests if there's a state capture. And what will happen is you'll not be serving your audience. And if you don't serve your audience, I'm sorry, you'll become irrelevant. So to answer your question, it's only that as much as possible, try to be right, as Charles says, but also get the story out. Don't sit on that story. That whistleblower who looked for you and gave you that information, their lives may depend on that. So it's better to get it out, get a reaction later.
Well, actually, that goes, you know, smoothly into the next part of this discussion, which is about censorship, because as much as we know Africa is not a country, and we have some places where the media is very free and other places where that's absolutely not the case, I think all of you would have at some point observed, experienced, or heard about some situation where you're seeing journalists, media houses being controlled or being repressed by the state, either directly or through laws or through financial, you know, kind of government funding being, as Charles mentioned earlier on. And so, in my experience, in my opinion, that's probably right up there in terms of the challenges a lot of media houses and journalists face on this continent and elsewhere. And I'm glad Maria mentioned, because with Kwanzaa TV, you were, I mean, I think the second suspension was because you shared something about the COVID-19 pandemic, which ultimately was actually you just reporting on what the US Embassy had said. And in a lot of people's opinion, it would have been... I'd love to start with you, Athandiwe, on how you feel in terms of the impact media repression is having on journalists in the South African context and wider.
I think mostly I would have to speak on a wider, in terms of the continent itself, because in South Africa, we do have different ways that government does try to censor in terms of advertising in newspapers. But if you look at the African context, it's nothing close to that. Like, for instance, right now in Botswana, we are, as the MNG, have to follow up on a particular story that's happening in Botswana around the president and the former president and all of those issues, because it can't be reported there because of the kind of censorship that does happen in some of those newsrooms. So in an African context, I think that's where we need to speak to, and I think panelists just explaining what's happening in that particular country is very scary. Like, as I said here, we do have one of the reporters who's been reporting for us from Eswatini. He does not live in Eswatini anymore. A lot of his content goes up online. We try and push it on the Mail and Guardian's platform. He travels a lot around South Africa now, because every time he writes about the King Mswati, the police force will come to his house, will harass his family, will kick down the doors. This is the lived experience of journalists every day. Never mind the fact that now we have to deal with all of the challenges of whether our models are working or financially viable or not. Journalists want to report and do what journalism is all about. They can't even do that in their country. So I think censorship does have a huge impact on how we put the content out there. Who is our audience? We're talking about audiences when journalists just can't even do their job, when they live in constant fear in their home country, where they have to go and live elsewhere just to cover that King Mswati decided to buy a new vehicle for one of his newest wives. You know, those kind of things. It is, I think, as a South African journalist, when I was chatting to this gentleman, he comes and visits our office every now and again, and as a South African journalist, I sit back in such awe at what journalists on the continent have to go through, have to be picked up by police officers, and just to do their job, and to get information out there. I still sit in awe and trying to think about, like, how is this in South Africa, if that would happen, what the kind of responses would be. And I think as the countries that journalists in those countries that can put the information out there, I think those kind of partnerships are going to be very important, because I don't think those governments are going to stop that kind of crackdown, especially with the divisions that are currently happening in different countries. So those kind of partnerships are going to be very vital to ensure that the information does get out there.
Yeah, thank you. I think the question of censorship and repression is it's a big issue, because it goes to the core of what we do. I mean, your ability to do what you need to do as a journalist. And I think Charles alluded to some of the more subtle ways, the ways in which this censorship thing has morphed over the years, and how it presents itself in different contexts. I mean, certainly in Kenya, yes, there is still government repression in many respects, but it is more subtle. I mean, it is more commercial, you know, because the government is an advertiser, and so they would typically not hesitate to press that button if they need to do that. But there is an even bigger one, which is commercial, because for as long as the business models of media as we know it have been appended in the manner that they have, and there haven't been alternatives, the media is always going to be vulnerable to that kind of problem, because it is easy to, you know, be idealistic about this and pontificate about we should fight this or the other thing. But the lived reality in many news organizations is exactly that there's a hostile business environment, and it costs money to do journalism. And so for as long as there isn't different avenues through which journalism can be funded in alternative ways, then that threat will always be there. And I think there should be many different pockets in which journalism happens, using different models that is not just restricted to the context of commercial media as we know it. So I do think that the conversation of censorship, especially insofar as it presents itself as a commercial problem, then needs to call for a discussion around how else do we finance journalism so that we can continue to do what we are here to do without too many problems and threats hanging over our heads as journalists. And I think that's been a conversation that is spoken about in different places, but for as long as we do not have alternative ways of funding journalism, I think that this conversation will remain academic, in my view.
Charles, you've had a fair amount of experience with censorship, repression, court cases. So how do you see things from, quote unquote, back in the day? Has it got worse? Has it got better? Are there ways to deal with it now?
On this issue, I come from, I think, a place that's very different from many journalists. Because for me, I was, had a death wish, so to speak. So I was, my view was that we would fight. That's why I went to court more times than all Ugandan journalists since independence combined. And I used to carry my bag for prison in the back of the car every day. So it's Boniface Mwangi will understand this. Because I think that in Africa there is a bit of a rosy view about the journalism, and I think too many of us are not willing to take the pain. And I think that we have to be willing to take the pain and realize that that is part of the deal. So in fact, I think people today, are less willing to,
go to jail.
To go to jail and to take these hits. And I mean, I can understand that, but I think that if we don't accept that you'll be knocked down, that you'll be jailed, that you'll be kicked, you'll be denied bail and all that, it's just not going to work.
I see loads of budding journalists out in the audience be like, absolutely, really want to do this. So I think one of the things that that brings the discussion to is funding, is, as you said, Joe, journalism costs money, running the media house costs money, and you have various ways of making that money, government advertising being one of them. What are the ethics around that, if any? Do you have any?
The ethics around government advertising. I think the model itself, it's back on. I think the model itself has been around government advertising in newspapers. I think that's just part of some legislative, and I'm thinking from just on a South African perspective, like the government has to advertise things in publications, mostly newspapers, to get information to people. They have to do that, so that's just part of what they do. But then you get different kinds of advertising, and now they want to move to advertorials in particular papers. So there is that, and ethically speaking, because it's something that we have been doing, but once it starts moving into like a kind of a newsroom environment and where there's those kind of discussions happen, then that becomes a problem. However, one of I was actually looking at this as one of the challenges in our newsroom around the funding models, and one of the big, it's so weird how Africa is quite different to like your Southeast Asia and how different their funding model is, because here we're still talking about advertising and we're still talking about government and so forth, but in your Southeast Asia, you get up to 70-80% of a newsroom's funding coming from external donors, from actual donors. But here in Africa, we only have 20 to 25% of that kind of funding that is coming from donors. So somehow, I think our discussion does need to move towards what is our engagement around donors. We're asking about ethical issues around government, but are there ethical issues around getting funding from donors, and how does that grow, and how does that assist in newsrooms being able to do what they need to do in a very difficult environment where government is saying, we're going to shut you down, we're not going to give you money, we're not going to do this, where the funding, the actual models itself to fund journalism, people paying for journalism, whether it's paywalls, whether it is some kind of subscription or community-based, those are not working because we're in a very different kind of environment where people are not kind of used to paying for news. So we have to begin to be able to split up how we get to paying for news, whether it's part of government advertising. Partly so, we need a growing number of donors to come into the space, because this is a public good, to come into the space, and not for it to be 20 to 25%. We should be getting to 50%. We also need funding models that are coming from our newsrooms, because they do, if they're coming from outside, we're not beginning to understand the value of journalism. Funding models that are coming from our newsrooms, and more engagement with the communities that we're trying to service as well.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to talk about the ethical considerations when you're dealing with the government as an advertiser, it obviously would have to stretch to other businesses, and as my colleague mentioned, even to the donors. And this question, I think, has never been a big issue when everything was working well in media houses. I mean, there was a time when there was a really big divide between the commercial parts of media and what happened in the newsroom, so much so that journalists were completely oblivious to what was happening in sales and all of these places. And that time, in those days, at least I know in this country, there was very little correlation. The government did not see it as a weapon that they would use against the media, that, oh, if you didn't cover this or you covered it in a particular way, then we will not advertise. Because that relationship was hinged on legal requirements that, you know, the government wants to do something, they need to put this out there for people to read. And what other way than to put it on TV or in 2 national newspapers? There were requirements like those ones, and they still exist. And so it only became a real problem when they began coupling commercial relationships at that level with editorial content. And I think that is what even the relationship with the normal advertisers has become. It never used to be like that. It was purely because there is a job that the media house is doing for that advertiser, and then they give the media house money. It had nothing to do with journalism. But because censorship has become more sophisticated, then now we are having this problem. But I think looking for alternative funding models, for example, there are many places where the whole idea of reader revenue is working, where you basically engage directly with your audiences and the different communities that you serve, who see real value in what you have and are willing to put their money in it. And I think that is something that if there are ways of deepening that, it is a way of doing that. I mean, people have, that comes in different models, and people have membership, you know, where you have these people who truly own what you do, and you can let them in on all manner of activities that you have within that media house. So I do think that there are real concerns now, ethical concerns, freedom concerns, whether it is with government, whether it is commercial entities, or indeed, as she says, even with donors. I mean, who's that who said there's no free lunch? I think that sometimes there is no requirement about you know, what you can pursue, but the fact that you only have money to pursue something about this topic obviously means that you may not have money to pursue something else which you may have wanted to pursue. So I think these are really important conversations, and they are existential, and that is why I think they are not just going to be academic conversations that we have to come up with big reports and things like that. But I think it needs to go to the level where we can actually start seeing real progress on the ground that allows journalists to do stories that truly matter without looking over their shoulders about who's going to pay for this or who's going to be upset.
Oh wow, 5 minutes. Hey, time flies when you're having fun. Well, I was having fun, I don't know about you. Okay, so I guess with 5 minutes left, I'm going to ask the panelists to finish up with their last comments about our discussion. And I think the thing I would want to ask is, in terms of, you know, we've talked about the money, but and it's kind of come up through the discussion. What fuels the news agenda? So is it, before the age of social media, what you as news editors or as activists?
The microphone.
Oh, is it not working? It is. It is? Okay, good. Yeah, we talked about the money question, and now I just want to talk about what fuels the news agenda. How do you all now decide what is news? What kind of news you want to deliver? You know, we've seen the rise of publications like The Elephant, The Continent, Africa Uncensored. They're doing analysis, they're doing long reads, they're doing video documentaries. How do you see newsrooms being influenced by what's going on social media? Maria, as an activist, the discussions you have on Maria Spaces, you know, how many newsrooms will come to you and say, oh, we saw you discussing that, we will report about it now. So I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, I just wanted for me to answer that, to talk about the censorship of lawfare. Lawfare means the government wages a war using the law. So they legalize, they criminalize activities that would be normal. They make it criminal for, let's say, the media to cover a victim who's talking about, you know, enforced disappearances. Now, if you have that kind of context, and I'm sure that there is quite a number of countries that would relate, it becomes very difficult for the newsroom to really set the agenda. The only thing that is safe is to go and cover what the minister is saying at a launch of an event, or, you know, the president inaugurating something. I think that when you ask about what can be done, I always insist that it, just like the politicians say, is something that also we journalists have to say. What do the people want? And it sounds very almost democratic, but if we look at the business models that work, however much as journalists we may try to hold our noses, they're the so-called bloggers who actually make money out of it. So in Tanzania, Mange Kimambi makes money. She's just basically looking at what she calls breaking news, but it's around relationships, human interest, and so on and so forth. I think you also have in Kenya a similar Obare who also is making quite good money about it. Now, instead of, you know, journalists going like, oh my God, I would never touch it, is just to say, what is it that works for them? What is it that they appeal to the people who are ready to actually spend money, even if it's not a lot, but they're ready to subscribe and get that kind of news? And not necessarily because we need to do what they're doing, but we need to understand what motivates people to actually give money to get that news. What kind of news are we talking about? And I think that the key here is human interest. And it's so wide, but it is about people's relationship, what is happening. If you're going to be talking about economy, how does that impact everybody's pocket? So there is a lot of that around, but just to get around also to what you talked about, the funding model, just to wind it down, I think the funding model has to be to tell your audience and to be able to gauge your audience that they're loyal enough to keep you going. Are you able to tell your audience, kindly raise, each of you give me 1,000 Kenya shillings or 500 Kenya shillings or 100 Kenya shillings for me to stay afloat? And then see, if your response is low, it means that they're not very interested in keeping you afloat. Then you need to work better, get better stories out. Again, my last message, adapt or die. I know I sound gloomy, but that's the truth.
Okay, I've got 2 minutes left, so Charles, I'm gonna let you finish.
You know, it really hasn't changed much. It's, if it bleeds, it leads. And you know, and that brings you the money. So I think that, you know, the platforms have changed, but that logic hasn't. The second thing is that if you look at the success, and it goes to the question you say, I think that the people who are making money are the ones who are now go beyond the leads and up market. I mean, if you look, the genre freaks of this world, and people like that, in Africa, Daily Maverick. I love them. I don't know whether they are making money, but I think they do some very creative work around their newsletter and website. So basically, I think that in this digital age, for particularly the mainstream media, I think it's you have to go up.
And I think that's it because I have been tardy with my timekeeping. I'm so sorry that I didn't make time for a Q&A, but I'm sure all your panelists would be happy to speak to you afterwards, so please do grab them. Please make the most of all the wealth of talent here, and don't be shy and talk to people. And thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being here. Censorship. I mean, if you want to ask the questions, I'm happy to stay here the rest of the day, guys. No problem for me.
All right, I think we are good. Before you leave, we have some gifts.
One or two? One. Oh. Thank you.
On Valentine's Day?
The last love's best.
Thank you. Look at that. Look at that. Which one? You got one? No.
The last loves best. Thank you so much for all your input. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I know we have burning questions. Thank you. I know we have burning questions, and we'll get maybe to ask those questions maybe later. But for now, I think we go to the next session.
How do you keep your toilets clean?
I use normal detergent and bleach for washing.
The detergent and bleach cleanless can leave behind yellowness, rust and germs. Harpic's 10 times better cleaning compared to regular detergents and bleach, and kills 99.9% illness-causing germs in your toilet, including the COVID-19 virus.
Sometimes love is sweet to her.
I know that we've only just met, and
when true love comes your way, it just takes a few minutes to recognize it.
And other times, it is so bitter that she can't recognize it.
No!
Get away from her! Let her go!
You killed him!
Guilt.
No, I didn't kill him, I swear!
Get the vet!